as they were. Thank you so much, everyone, for what was an interesting debate. Allow me to just do roll call to make sure everyone is here. Opening government. Here. Opening up. Opening up.
Sorry, we're here.
Closing up.
We're here.
And closing opposition.
Here.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for what was an interesting debate. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to do the rankings, then I'm going to go through the justification for those rankings. And then, yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I might open opportunities in between in case there's something that is not clear. And then you can ask there. Please don't use that opportunity to attack the call, but rather to gain clarity on how certain issues were weighed, specifically if you feel like there's something that has not been covered. So in the end, the rankings were not unanimous, so I probably need to flag that out. I think it is very close where there was a split, but I'm going to try and explain both sides. So I'm going to start from there, and then I'm going to move downwards. So in the end, there was a split on first. So the first ends up being OG, but it's on a split of 1-1, but chair in majority, CG in second, OO in third, and then CO, unfortunately, in fourth. So I'm going to repeat OG, CG, OO, and CO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the top, going downwards, explaining why the team in first beat the teams below them, then second, then go on like that. Let's start with the team in first and opening government and opening up. So there's a split here, and I'm going to start with the dissent, explaining why the panel did think that there was potential, or CG, the panel thought CG beat OG, and the reasons why. The reasons why CG, or the reasons why panel thought that CG was beating OG first, was on the question of the principle. The panel thought that, for example, the fact that CG was able to show that there is a greater obligation, or the necessity for the obligation for the state to do this, answering what OO had raised specifically to OG, why the state must do it, was better answered by the team in closing government, to the extent that OG was unable to explain the question of why this principle is absolutely necessary, or the tipping point for that. The panel did believe that CG explaining, for example, that how the state has acted in the past is what necessitates the choice that the state makes in the future. And to that extent, the principal obligation then becomes greater to the extent that it's almost reparative to a harm that they've caused, while on OG, it's really just a generic principle. So that's the first reason the panel did think that CG is beating OG. The second thing is with regards to the tangible impacts. The panel did think that CG was able to derive more tangible impacts than opening government, explaining why, for example, they're able to get more efficiency by getting much greater mainstreaming this process, and therefore getting more access to minorities who can be able to then get more help, and these people are important. The tangibility of that change, and also the idea of, for example, getting more liberalization because more and more people then are opting into this services, therefore creating that tangible change. I think the panel did think that closing government was beating opening government by having much clearer mechanisms for how they're able to get more tangible impacts, and like opening government whose impacts are still unclear as to how they're able to, for example, trickle down to people. I think this was something that was mentioned. And then the whole idea of structural issues, they did think it was an important harm, especially with regards to protecting, vulnerable individuals, getting more information for structural complicity, the church and religious organizations and stuff like that. Dissenting view for why they was, I think it was very, very, very close, but I'm going to probably just justify the same method on the same issues, trying to explain the distinctions. The first is weighing against opening government's principle here is that opening government's principle is first not engaging what OO's principle is saying, but secondly, it's defensive in its nature and is not really showing, for example, I didn't get what that meant, but I think it was more of it's defensive, therefore it's not really answering the question as to how it practically or it potentially could benefit people. So here are the responses. First, I do think opening government has a principle beyond the idea of consent and the whole idea of autonomy, which is really the generic case when it comes to religion. I think there were other subtle parts of the OG principle that were not weighed against, specifically towards the more offensive parts of the OG principle. What were these offensive parts? OG talks about two things offensively. First, they talked about the idea of the reconciliation of identities to the extent that somebody could have identities that are competing with each other that need reconciliation, and how these programs can be able to get these individuals individuals to reconcile these identities to allow them then to be able to self-actualize much better. The second thing they run here is the idea of happiness, to the extent that you get these people more likely to, buy into or get much more formed identities that, are not based on coercion and all these things. This could improve the happiness of people. I think that's in the PM. But there's something else the DPM said that I thought was also very offensive with regards to state obligations are not just premised on the idea of necessity, but they're also based on the idea of utility. And I think the deputy weighs out why, to the extent that their world is being able to maximize the utility, and I think by utility here, it was happiness or the ability of people to be able to self-actualize and all these things, then the state has an obligation to do this. And I think this was in response to what O was saying on the lack of necessity. This OG's response is maximization of that utility is something that's good. I think the question then in the weighing of the Gov bench becomes, why does the reparative principle, in essence, for example, paying back for the past wrongs, for example, you've led to a lot of coercion of people into religion, therefore you have almost the necessity or the obligation to sort of repair for some of those harms, beat the principle of obligation, the utility principle, because I do think that there is that idea of reparations or paying back, and there's also the idea of utility, and both these obligations are very intrinsic and very integral to the state. Sitting as an average intelligent voter, I did need to understand why, for example, that reparative principle becomes something that outweighs the principle that OG runs, which is on a maximization of happiness, and maybe you can call it utility for now. And I think, therefore, I didn't really get that analysis, which is why I couldn't just put the obligation of reparations above the idea of utility, which I think OG had fairly and sufficiently proven, which I think is also offensive. I don't think it's defensive. Maybe I'm stepping in, but I do think there is a positive angle to it that they do explain on that. 2, on the impacts, because that's the second level of weighing. CG does, I think, prove quite successfully that you do improve access, and when you do improve access, this mainstreams it and creates some very tangible change that I think they are able to prove quite sufficiently. The question, and I think falls down again to what I think on the first principle on weighing these things, which is that OG does have quite a lot of tangible impacts that I think are untouched by what OO is saying. And I think the CG strategy here was showing the inefficiency of the OG's case and then trying to show how they fill it in or prove it better. Something I think they do quite sufficiently on some of those impacts very well on issues like, for example, liberalization and, for example, the idea of access. But there's still a lot more that needed to be weighed up against. And I think if it was not that, I think the other thing that CG maybe should have been trying to do is explain why that impact of access and liberalization and you accessing it becomes something that is higher or probably more important than the other impacts in the round. To the extent that I don't get this, I do think probably the OG impacts still stand. What are these impacts? OG talks about things, for example, like, and I'm not going to repeat them, the idea of helping people get, for example, there's a transition impact. For example, when we have these things, people are able to get better support, better communities. They're able to alleviate their fears. They no longer get fear tactics from the comparative where people are just shamed into remaining into the religion or fear-mongered into remaining into the religion. And they're able to explain why that transition happens better. They have the idea of happiness. They have the idea of maximizing utility for people who are in the fence. There's a lot of impact in there. And I do think CG does reach other impacts on, for example, creating greater access to people, reaching more minority communities, mainstreaming it, getting more information on some of the inefficiencies or the things that the church has done that is wrong. Things that are all believed, I think, to be true. Again, it comes down to the question I asked in the first one. Why does this outweigh what opening government says? I don't think the whip does it. I think the whip doesn't explain why these impacts outweigh what opening government has already achieved as an impact. I think they went after what OG didn't do right on, like, for example, liberalization and the framing. Even if I did believe that, what about the rest? Why do your impacts outweigh them? I think that's why I think OG just puts above them. In essence, I do think CG's engagement is better than OG's to some extent, but was engagement a metric to put CG over OG? Again, the third level here is to say, for me to do that, it has to believe that OG's case was at risk or was sufficiently damaged by OOs and was probably losing to OO for me to say maybe on engagement, CG beats OG, something didn't happen. Anyway, I've taken a lot of time on that. Hope it's quite clear. Let me run through the rest of the rankings. CG, OG against the other teams. Why is OG, first of all, beating the team in third? OO. First, on the principle, OO says that this is absolutely not necessary and this is not something that Western liberal democracies should do. On the idea of Western liberal democracies, OO says they shouldn't infringe on choice. I don't think OG ever said that they were going to take anyone away anyone's choice or favor anyone. They do explain that it's for somebody who comes to them, somebody who is on the fence, somebody who is debating between these two religions. Therefore, they're not like favoring anyone. I think this was something that was quite responded to well. Secondly, they're able to show that there is also a responsibility for Western liberal democracies to increase happiness, and they explained how they were able to do that. On OO, I think you explain what Western liberal democracy should not do, which is like show favoritism. Some that is true. I don't think this clash wins anyone the debate, to the extent that both of you prove to me obligations of states, no one really proving why one is better than the other. So the extent OG is showing me that it can also be done, I think just neutralizes that. But where the debate then tips is on the following two with regards to the legitimacy of this choice. Opening government gives me a lot of reasons why people don't consent into this, why people are unlikely to opt out using the current mechanisms. OG's PM had already given a speech about why the current status quo is not working with regards to the coercion of individuals, the coercion of, for example, social pressure. Children cannot opt out, the idea of heaven and hell and the metaphysical idea, to the extent that they need this option for them to be able to do this. OO saying it's unjust to use taxpayers' money to show, for example, favoritism is outweighed by the potential harm that is OG's lack of autonomy and lack of consent and the oppression of religion on people, showing that there is a potential justification to the extent that we allow people more choice and more autonomy on these things. And for example, the idea of backlash, I think this is well responded to preemptively by the PM as to why backlash is symmetric. And I think OO's deputy does touch, I think, on some reasons as to why backlash here becomes slightly different. But the question was not whether backlash maybe changes too much. It's to the extent, how much does that backlash change? I think OG had already explained sufficiently that the incentives of the religion doesn't change, and why more backlash doesn't really tip the debate in any way. And to the extent that I do explain, or Deputy Prime Minister, opposition leader explains potentially that there could be more backlash than what exists in status quo, why does that backlash then become a bad thing? They say it harms the relationship between the church and the state, and why that's something that's a bad thing. But I think, as OG says, in Western liberal democracy, that's not really the worst thing, to the extent that it's more about protecting the people, the minorities, as the deputy says, and also improving, as weighed out, the utility of individuals to just access their identities, their happiness, and all these things, which outweighs the potential backlash that is fairly symmetric. I think OG had already proved that. So it doesn't really win the debate to have more backlash, but rather the more change that happens when individuals can access more choices and stuff like this. Lastly, why OG is beating CEO, I think it's firstly on the POI. They do identify that a lot of CEO's case is in contention with OOs, which then necessitate, like, shows a knife, which means we can't credit a second extension quite largely on, for example, the idea of why losing faith is a bad thing, because OO has already says that's not a bad thing. So when you say it's a bad thing, that is what the question was. That is really in contention with each other. You can't say RFRs are good, and then in the whip you say, I mean, in the closing opposition, you say it's bad. I think this is directly in contradiction with that. We can't really credit it. But even if we did, for example, the ability of people to lose faith, we did need an adjustment, for example, on why, for example, the choices that people made being oppressed or being coerced on these individuals, something that's a good thing. There was a lot of lack of responsiveness from CEO to what OG had said quite largely. There's a lot of ideas on coercion and why this mostly is coercive. There's a lot of analysis on why these identities are usually in contention, why these people most of the time are looking for a way out. There's a lot of analysis on, for example, the idea of, there's a lot that is unresponded to by the closing opposition to opening government, which also puts them below. And then finally, on the idea of backlash, there was a lot of preemptive engagement that is not engaged with as to why backlash is fairly symmetric. But even if we did credit the CEO backlash, it is very derivative of opening up. Almost everything CEO says on why backlash increases, direct attack on religion, direct attack on God, direct attack on its communities, is technically what the deputy was saying as to why backlash increases and the unique backlash that happens on their side. Fine, I do think maybe they add one new mechanism. I don't think it beats, for the same reason OO is losing to OG. You can also transmit to that one mechanism why it doesn't beat what OG is saying. Anyway, any questions from OG as to how they rank against other teams? Okay. Okay, guessing OG is fine, so we can move then to CG and how they rank against other teams. So CG's case, firstly, against opening opposition. I do think that there's very good engagement by CG to exact everything that opening opposition says. And I think this is why it was a bit clearer here. For example, on the principle, opening op says, firstly, it's unjustified to use taxpayers' money to do this. CG is able to respond quite successfully as to why taxpayers' money must be used to do this, because part of the harm is based on state complicity in pushing religion over others. For example, the state has not been neutral. They've done a lot of coercion. They've been responsible for a lot of the reasons why people are almost boxed into religions, and they're able to explain why this is almost like a correction mechanism against that, therefore justifying the use of state money. They then say Western liberal democracies should not do this because, they're seen as favoritism. But CG is able to explain why that favoritism has existed for a long period of time. And this is not favoritism, but rather balancing against what has specifically, or the harm that has been caused by the former favoritism of the state. The second thing is with regards to backlash. I think CG borrows quite some bit from OG with regards to backlash, explaining why backlash is fairly likely to be symmetric. But on a second level, they're able to explain why, to a great extent, this backlash doesn't really change the incentives of these religious people, to the extent that the whip explains that most of these people don't care how you do it or who is doing it. To the extent that is an attack on religion, it will be backlash. They'll backlash against it anyway. And I think this is quite successfully neutralizing the unique mechanisms for backlash, because I think the way the whip explained it is that people care about the idea of religion and not the method or the political philosophy of the religion, or who is trying to change people's religious positions. And that's how religious people likely behave. Therefore, that reduces the amount of backlash, or it shows that it's fairly going to happen either way and doesn't really change. On the necessity, I think CG is able to respond quite specifically, because what OO is saying is these things already exist, why do them? CG explains exactly why it becomes necessary, because it isn't mainstream, not many people know, and to the extent that they're able to reach more people, this especially more minorities and more vulnerable people, it does improve the access, and therefore the impact of that is therefore giving it the necessity to the extent it creates or expands the access and allows more people to make more rational, much better choices. So to the extent that I think on the principle, CG is able to respond and quite effectively show that the principle is weighing against them, to the extent that the necessity comes from the correction, backlash and showing how symmetric it is, but thirdly, showing the necessity of the choice and the weighing of the impact here, showing why the impact is much greater when we allow this to happen. CG is beating opening up. CG against CO, similar to what I said. First, backlash symmetric, and CG is able to respond effectively to the question of backlash, explaining the incentives of religious people and explaining why it's likely to be symmetric, to showing why, to the extent that backlash happens, it's outweighed by the positive impacts that they're able to get with regards to access, with a positive principle obligation that they are able to fulfill, and all these things. I think CG is able to beat CO by just showing that even if we buy CGO's case in its best, first, it happens either way, but secondly, it's outweighed by the positive benefits they're able to achieve. And then lastly, as I said, a lot of the CEO's case on the individual benefits of religion are in contention and cannot be credited because they are in contention with what OO says. I think, therefore, to that extent, even if we did buy it, the positive aspects of religion, again, unresponsive to what CG says with regards to how religion, and especially those who exist in the most conservative of these religions, need this option to be able to opt out. There was a lot of unresponsiveness again from CEO towards CG. So that's CG and why they rank against above the other two teams. Any other questions? Okay, I guess that's fine. Lastly, why is CO below OO? I think it's quite implied based on everything I've said. On the question of backlash, CEO says, here are all the reasons why people will increase backlash: direct attack on religion because you're seeing them as bad, attack on God because you're promoting atheism, and attack on the community because you get people out of the community. But for example, if you read what opening op says in the deputy speech, they give the same reasons for why people will opt out. That the distinction of this is that the state is funding atheism. It means that you're taking people away from the religion and it's attack on the religion. And this is you upset the balance of the relationship. So the same reasons why CG gives for why backlash increases are the same that OO gives. I don't think CO in at any point weighs out what the different mechanism they use outweighs what opening opposition had said. Therefore, I do think they are losing to them to the extent that they fail to weigh. But secondly, a lot of what they say is already in the opening opposition case. And the third case on the harm of the individual, for example, you lose faith, you lose your community, and why the alternative of moderate religions is better. This is a different alternative from what OO says. And maybe I can touch on this meta a bit. The only point where I think CO gets away with this is if they're able to explain why the OO alternative, or the way OO framed the counter prop, whether it's an alternative, anyway, let's call it an alternative, is unjustified, because OO says that this is fine, it's unnecessary, and all these things. So you needed to explain either why that position is undefensible, or two, that position is against the spirit of the, we needed a bit more analysis as to why we can get a different like model as to how the op case looks like from CO. And I think this was not done sufficiently. I think there's a lot more to speak about on the meta, but I don't want to go into it. All I want to say is that to the extent that you're going in parallel positions from your opening on the model upon which your case is going, OO says it's fine, you say, no, it's not fine, we must maintain religions and maintain moderate religions. I think we needed a bit more meta-analysis on this first to justify why this position then can shift. I think there was more necessity for this. To that extent, the defense was you're showing a greater harm. The issue is not the harm you're portraying, but rather the method you're trying to say we should adopt alternatively. And therefore, this is still in contradiction with what opening up ran. OG is right, CG is right. This is sort of like contradictory, or I don't know, a knife. So it can't be credited against everything else. And what can be credited, as I said, is derivative. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, ask now. Other than that, best of luck.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Is it possible?